Nomad gets to be my Kimmy's titties hair today. Titty hair. Spider dog. Figured I'd see if I could get more than 0 people inside my stream. Just uh, going off the cuff. Gonna be a little slow. It's freaking Friday. Hey, hey. Hell yeah. 2:30 Friday. Can't beat it. Yeah, I would have rather been here than in my office dealing with issues. All right, so we're going to do the second part of my anti-Semitism USA. And what's up, Joey? Justin. All right, let me get this started. I'm just going to respond to comments, questions, and as things come up during this.
Support for Antisemitism USA comes from the Henry Luce Foundation and the David Bruce Smith Foundation. Man, street parking in big cities, it's horrible. Spots are hard to find. And even if you get lucky, you still need a bag of quarters or you have to work with one of those cumbersome parking apps on your phone. But not if it's Sunday. Whether you're in Sacramento or Seattle, Atlanta or Boston, you don't have to feed the meter on Sunday. You can stay in that parking spot as long as you darn well please. You can park your car and sleep in it all day and never feed the meter, not even once. Because on Sundays, parking is free. Nobody objects to free parking. But there are some other Sunday laws that are more controversial. For example, in some parts of the country, on Sundays, you can't buy a beer. You can't even shoot a deer. And in some places, car dealerships have to close. These Sunday restrictions have a long history. Originally, they were pretty strict. Take the early Jamestown settlement. A 1611 law forbade any violation of the Sabbath by gaming at home or in public. And every man and woman had to attend church on Sunday, twice. Repeat offenders could be whipped or even executed. Many places did enforce laws against profaning the Sabbath. No work, no commerce. And over time, for reasons that remain fuzzy,
that's like Pittsburgh and Philly traffic. I'm parking as well. They're never going to give up their parking laws. I grew up in a dry county, Angel. It was every day that way. You'd have to drive across the into the city of Atlanta.
these statutes came to be known as blue laws. These blue laws,
Not blue balls.
can be baffling. After all, how did Sunday even become the Sabbath? Isn't the Sabbath from sundown on Friday until nightfall on Saturday evening? That's the original Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath. Early Christians began worshiping on Sundays, which they called the Lord's Day. out of their belief that Jesus had risen from the dead on a Sunday. Over time, they conflated these two terms, the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. So when Christians passed laws to protect the Sabbath and keep it holy, they meant Sunday, their Sabbath, their day of rest. Through the middle of the 20th century, many American states and communities had laws that shut down most businesses on Sundays. Most workers were grateful for a day of rest, although they might be annoyed that they couldn't spend it at the saloon. But the blue laws were particularly problematic for one group of citizens, Jewish Americans, because the Sunday was not.
Car dealerships closed on Saturday, maybe on Sunday. I know down here, you're in the South. Saturday's the busiest day for car dealerships. Yeah, well, that on the other hand is not long, I'm sure. More tax revenue coming in.
Was not their Sabbath. So if they were observant, they had to close on Saturday and then again, because of the Christian blue laws, on Sunday. And this became a point of tension. I'm Mark Oppenheimer, and this is Antisemitism USA, a podcast about the history of anti-Semitism in the United States. Episode 3, Merchants and Money. In our last episode, we talked about the exclusion of Jews from citizenship rights, an exclusion rooted in the Christian European sense of Jews as religious outsiders. In this episode, we're talking about economic stereotypes and resentments. These prejudices and tropes also had a long history in Europe, and they took root in American culture as well. By the middle of the 19th century,
we see those still too, right? From our little gnome friend. Even as early as today, based on Spider Dog's wonderful news, hard-hitting news station. What's up, Wally?
Jewish immigration to the U.S. had accelerated. What had been an American Jewish population of a few thousand at the start of the century, by the Civil War had grown to around 50,000. Most of them were German-speaking Jews from Central Europe. After the discovery of gold in California, thousands of these new arrivals joined other Americans heading west seeking their fortune. Many Jewish settlers in California were merchants, setting up shops in towns and cities. By the 1870s, Jews made up nearly 10% of San Francisco's booming population. There were so many Jewish-owned textile warehouses in the heart of San Francisco that other residents just called them Jew shops. California was a pretty good place to be Jewish. The mix of peoples, including Native Americans, free African Americans, and Chinese immigrants, ensured that Jews were closer to the top of the social hierarchy than the bottom. There also wasn't much of a Protestant establishment to hold them down. But as California's white population grew, its political leaders talked about passing a Sunday closing law. Here's Jeremy Zeitlin, a California lawyer who has researched the history of the state's closing laws.
If Sunday closing laws are about consolidating how a community acts, folks that you see who are sort of outside the community, I don't want to milk a stereotype, like the passing Jewish peddler, like, well, he's not part of the community ever anyway, so why should we let his alien considerations affect the way we build our communities? And I think Sunday closing laws, that's what they're about. They're about consolidating a wholesome Christian life.
California's politicians knew that such a law would disadvantage Jews. And for some state leaders, that was precisely the point. It was a feature, not a bug.
Some folks understood that if they, Christian business owners, were forced to close down, they would lose business on Sunday to a Jewish shopkeeper.
In 1855, as the California legislature considered a Sunday closing law, Speaker of the Assembly William Stowe stated that he had, quote, no sympathy with the Jews. They ought to respect the law and opinions of the majority, he said. They were a class of people who only came here to make money and leave as soon as they had. Stowe was pointing the finger in the wrong.
Nothing new, right? The stereotypes are follow mainly because of jealousy.
Direction. Jews were actually far more likely than non-Jews to stay in California permanently. But nativism was a powerful political force in the mid-1850s. For the most part, nativists were Protestants upset at the tide of Catholic immigration from Ireland. Stowe probably didn't like Catholics, but he also wanted to discourage more Jews from coming to California. Stowe said, quote, I am for a Jew tax that is so high that Jews would not be able to operate any more shops. In a sense, a Sunday closing law would function like Stowe's desired Jew tax, making observant Jews close their shops an extra day each week. Because many Californians were indifferent to the Christian Sabbath, the proposed 1855 law didn't pass. But the legislature returned to it several years later. Again, there was discussion of how a Sunday closing law would harm Jewish businesses. An article in the Sacramento Bee newspaper explained that it is particularly hard upon Hebrews, as they have a Sabbath of their own to keep, and are by this law forced to keep the Christian Sabbath also. Ignoring such arguments, the legislature in 1858 passed a law that required that no person shall, on the Christian Sabbath, keep open any store, warehouse, mechanic shop, workshop, banking house, or manufacturing establishment, or sell any goods, wares, or merchandise on that day. After it passed, the Sacramento Bee reported that the Hebrews intend to test the law at an early date.
Goes to the subversion, right? You start a rumor that the people you want to other are going to start a problem at a later date, some nebulous form.
Morris Newman became the test case. Newman was born in present-day Poland around 1810. After coming to the States, he lived in Texas for a while, then migrated to California, where he and his wife had the last of their 4 children. He established himself in Sacramento. He was a trustee at Congregation B'nai Israel, the oldest congregation in town. He didn't own any land, but he ran a clothing shop. In 1860, he told census officials that he was worth around $2,000. He wasn't wealthy, but he was doing well. Days after the new blue law passed, Newman was arrested for violating the law by keeping his shop open on a Sunday. And he was fined $50. For refusing to pay the fine, he was sentenced to a month in jail. He petitioned the court for release by challenging the law's constitutionality, and the California Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. One of Newman's attorneys was Solomon Heidenfeld, one of the most prominent Jews in California politics. After coming within a hair's breadth of a U.S. Senate seat in 1851, he got a seat on the state Supreme Court as a consolation prize. Newman's legal team argued that the Sunday closing law infringed on their client's religious freedom. The California Constitution guaranteed free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference. This blue law was pretty obviously discriminatory. Under this act, the lawyers maintained, the Jew can only labor 5 days, but the Christian 6. Heidenfeld pointed to the clear religious purpose of the law. The statute, after all, was called an act for the better observance of the Sabbath. And they didn't mean the Jewish Sabbath. But attorneys for the state emphasized that the law had a secular purpose. Look, they said, it gives everyone a day of rest. The law didn't stop Newman from closing his shop on Saturday and attending services at B'nai Israel. The state also noted that many other states, such as Pennsylvania, had upheld the constitutionality of Sabbath observance laws. Not coincidentally, it was a Jewish merchant, Abraham Wolfe, who had challenged the Pennsylvania law. Here's historian David Sahat, author of This Earthly Frame, The Making of American Secularism.
And there were various Jews who challenged these laws in court. And what they were told constantly is, you can absolutely close your shop on Saturday, and it is not discriminating against you to say you also must keep it closed on Sunday, because this is a Christian nation. And there was really nothing that Jews could do to get around that. That was the law of the land. That was what the
most of the southern states running across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana have some pretty crazy ones, huh?
what the courts kept telling them. And so they either had to violate their faith, or they had to compete economically at a disadvantage by losing out that business for 2 days rather than just one.
One would have expected California Supreme Court to follow these precedents, but it didn't. A split court ruled in Newman's favor, invalidating the act and his jail sentence. Chief Justice David Terry, writing for the majority, declared himself in favor of not only toleration, but religious liberty in its largest sense, a complete separation between church and state, and a perfect equality without distinction between all religious sects. And with that, Morris Newman was allowed to keep his clothing shop open on Sundays, at least for 3 years. In 1861, the legislature passed a very similar law, and this time, a non-Jew ended up as the test case. By then, the makeup of the Supreme Court had changed. Chief Justice David Terry, who had written the opinion in the Newman case, had shot a U.S. senator in a duel, and he'd had to resign his seat on the court. It was still the semi-Wild West, but shooting senators was a bit too wild. Stephen Field, who had dissented in the Newman case, was now the Chief Justice, and the new court upheld the Sabbath Observance Act, stating that it only compelled citizens to rest, not to violate their consciences. So Morris Newman's case became a footnote rather than an important precedent in church-state law. Now, for a while, authorities did not crack down on those who profaned the Sabbath. Many saloons just stayed open. But then, officials in San Francisco made a very unpopular attempt to enforce the law. And it didn't work. There were just too many people breaking it, and you couldn't arrest them all. In response, the Democratic Party supported repealing the measure. And that's what they did after they won a state election.
Fucking Democrats.
That made California the first state in the country to repeal a Sunday closing law. California later passed a new law requiring employers to give their workers 1 day of rest every 7 days. But the choice of which day to rest was up to the boss, not the workers. So, were Sunday closing laws anti-Jewish? That depends. Sticking it to Jewish merchants was one reason California's politicians passed its Sabbath law. But in most parts of the country, blue laws weren't anti-Jewish in their intent. They could be in their enforcement, however. Laws were sometimes selectively used against Jews. In New York City, policemen were known to demand bribes from Jewish businesses wanting to stay open. Just as Jews in Maryland and other states had fought for the right to vote and hold office, Jews in California and elsewhere sought rights that they understood as inherent to citizenship, including the right to observe their own Sabbath. Morris Newman's victory in court was a relatively rare one in the 19th century. In fact, Jews and other religious minorities never did persuade the U.S. Supreme Court that Sunday closing laws were unconstitutional. Blue laws gradually withered away because American Christians stopped observing their own Sabbath. They wanted to shop and drink on Sunday. And so Jews got to as well. We'll be back with more after the break.
I have to say, I do appreciate the channels that go ahead and cut out their break time instead of making us sit through them. Spider Dog, Sinners. I mean, I'm I'm about as bad as any Christian not observing Sunday. I can't go sundown Friday to sundown on a Saturday. So 24 hours is tough to not even cause something else to work.
The story goes that whether Jewish immigrants came with nothing or came with just a little, they made it here. For Jews, the United States was different. There just wasn't that much anti-Semitism holding Jews back. And there's a lot of truth to that story. Not that it was easy to be a poor Jewish immigrant, but there were jobs here, and there was room for upward mobility. Here's historian Rachel Cranston, author of the book Ambivalent Embrace: Jewish Upward Mobility in Post-War America.
Generally speaking, most of the Jews living in the United States today are the descendants of the nearly 3 million Jews who left Eastern Europe between 1870 and 1924, when the Johnson-Reed Act restricted migration from Eastern and Southern Europe. And the Jewish immigrants who came from Eastern Europe, for the most part, came to the United States in dire poverty, having sold most of their assets just to make the journey. And most of these immigrants did not have much English. They didn't have much of a secular education, and they worked at the margins of the American economy. They found their first jobs as factory workers, often in the garment industry or in petty retail, peddling or selling from push carts. And some also supplemented their income by taking in boarders of newer immigrants and had them pay rent to live in their slum apartments and charging rent for room and board.
Because the children and grandchildren of those immigrants had more educational opportunities, and because many of them succeeded economically, it's easy to presume that Jews were on a smooth, easy path of upward mobility. But it's not that simple. American Jews faced significant forms of discrimination, and they weren't alone. Italian Americans did too, as Irish Americans had in earlier decades. In 1882, Congress banned new Chinese immigrants from entering the country at all. Jews faced challenges, barriers, and impediments to success, some legal, some financial, and some violent. Many American Jewish men got their start by peddling. Here's historian Zev Elif, author of Who Rules the Synagogue? Religious Authority and the Formation of American Judaism.
Jews had an outsized role in peddling. Very often, a Jew from Eisenstadt would arrive by sail, usually a him, usually men. Single men came, single women generally did not, and married men preceded their families in migrating to the New World in the 19th century. Jews would come, they would meet a landsman, meaning somebody that they recognized, that they knew from their village in southern Germany, and they would maybe get some tips on how to peddle. Maybe they would be able to purchase certain lotions or oranges at wholesale, and they would build up a pack. They would take their business, because after all, if I'm from Eisenstadt and I meet somebody else and I've been here for a couple of weeks, I'm not about to sell my landsman lotions, whatever, for him to peddle in my area. Go off to Cincinnati, go to Cleveland, go to Chicago, go down south to Mobile, Alabama. And they created networks, social and economic networks with one another, which was pivotal in the economic transformation of Jews in this country. It also entrenched certain ideas of how Jews did business.
You heard what Elif just said, certain ideas about how Jews did business. What were those ideas? Well, they go way, way back. In medieval and early modern Europe, a disproportionate number of Jews had become merchants, moneylenders, and bankers. Why? Well, it's a long and complicated history.
Oh no, Todd. listen to the why we became merchants and lenders. What's up, Tom Donovan? Yes, facts are the kryptonite to disingenuous people.
It's not the case that Christians forced Jews to become moneylenders, and it's also not the case that most Jews were moneylenders, let alone wealthy moneylenders. But it is true that the church sometimes enforced prohibitions on usury or lending money at excessive rates and interest. And during those campaigns, Jews often were scapegoated, sometimes as grounds for their expulsion. One thing is clear: Christians developed harsh and persistent stereotypes about Jewish merchants and bankers. The most famous example is the character Shylock in Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice.
Shakespeare created one of the most important documents of anti-Jewish prejudice with The Merchant of Venice. The caricature of Shylock, images of him with a long nose, obviously being...
Remember that The Merchant of Venice was written a dozen years before the King James version of the Christian Bible, if you want to get any idea of what bent it takes on the 1611. Nah, Melissa, I was just being a little petty last night.
being deeply concerned about financial windfall at the expense of honesty and morality. In all likelihood, William Shakespeare never met a Jew.
In the play, Shylock takes revenge on a hateful Christian merchant. Instead of charging this man interest on a loan he desperately needs, Shylock forces him to accept a bond of a pound of flesh if he defaulted on his loan. And Shylock wasn't the worst depiction of a Jew in English literature. Chaucer, Marlowe, and Donne all referred to Jews murdering Christians. The image of the greedy and cruel Jewish merchant and banker became a key part of the way European and American Christians thought about Jews. And Americans applied these ideas to all sorts of Jews, from wealthy bankers to lowly peddlers to modest shopkeepers. In the mid-19th century, R.G. Dunn and Company became a national credit agency, providing information about individuals and businesses to its customers, telling people who was creditworthy and who wasn't. R.G. Dunn relied on local correspondence for its information, and some of these informants betrayed an unmistakable animus against Jews. Historian David Gerber read through the files for Buffalo, New York, which by the 1850s had a small Jewish community. What Gerber found in R.G. Dunn's reports was an American updating of the old trope of Jewish bankers and merchants. They were depicted as greedy and cruel and dishonest, particularly toward non-Jews. Here's a sampling of the different reasons provided for why Jews were not deemed creditworthy.
Is a Jew and will pay or not as he pleases.
Prudence in large transactions with all Jews should be used.
Responsible now, but is a Jew. There is no telling how long he will remain so.
Are Jews and should not be allowed to get behind.
Good, but Hebrew good.
He is a Jew, and although, in point of fact, he may now be perfectly responsible, yet Jews have a wonderful faculty of becoming, at almost any moment they choose, entirely irresponsible.
These reports advised against giving credit to Jewish merchants, or suggested that Jews only be advanced small amounts of money. Jews weren't the only groups singled out. Irish Americans, for instance, were presumed to be at a high risk of failure. But as Gerber notes, Jewish merchants were in a double bind. It wasn't that the credit agency's informants necessarily thought Jewish businesses would.
So, R.G. Dunn is the same as Dun and Bradstreet, where people get Dun and Bradstreet business intelligence even now. So there is a part of the Anti-Semitic sentiment. Oh, and Todd's watching Chicken Lady again. This ought to be funny.
Would fail. It was that Jewish merchants couldn't be trusted. So whether they succeeded or failed, other Americans should view them with suspicion. And these stereotypes had consequences. In California, Morris Newman and other Jews had to close on Sundays. In Buffalo, Jewish merchants struggled to get loans. Here's another one of those consequences. In 1862, during the Civil War, General Ulysses S. Grant issued his General Order Number 11. The order read,
"The Jews, as a class violating every..."
Yeah, Misty, the homesteader lady that makes him look dumb.
regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from receipt of this order.
This order expelled all Jews from Grant's military district, which included large portions of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Why would
Grant was doing a Doge before Doge was cool?
Grant issue such an order? Here's historian Jonathan Sarna, author of American Judaism, A History.
General Grant, like other generals at that time, believed that smuggling was a huge problem that was prolonging the war. If you could cut off smuggling, the South would not have the money to continue its war effort. And to his mind, the word smuggler and the word Jew were synonyms. Indeed, the tendency was to blame Jews, not just for smuggling, but for a whole range of Civil War era problems. Shoddy goods, Jews. And there are other similar kinds of problems that were blamed and placed on the shoulders of Jews. And of course, there were Jews who were smuggling and cheating and delivering shoddy merchandise. So that allowed you to reinforce the stereotype.
There were some Jews involved in smuggling cotton, which often meant bribing Union Army officers. But not all smugglers were Jews. In fact, Grant's own father was complicit in smuggling. But General Grant blamed Jews as a class.
It is the most notorious official act of anti-Semitism in all of American Jewish history. And there's nothing comparable, really, where there is an order against Jews as a class.
It was
I mean, if your dad's involved in smuggling, that what better way to eliminate competition by kicking the people out that you're accusing of doing the smuggling against? Kind of takes the stink off of yourself, right?
It was a throwback to the medieval expulsion orders, rooted in stereotypes about usurious Jewish moneylenders. In the end, Grant's order had little effect. Though some Jews were expelled from a few communities, Confederate attacks on telegraph lines delayed the order's transmission to most of Grant's subordinates, so they never heard about it. And Jews who got wind of the order immediately appealed to the highest authority in the land. President Abraham Lincoln overturned Grant's order within 2 weeks. Shortly after his 1868 election to the presidency, Grant wrote a letter that served as a public apology.
I have no prejudice against sect or race, but want each individual to be judged by his own merit. Order number 11 does not sustain this statement, I admit, but then I do not sustain that order.
Then, shortly before he left the White House, Grant attended the dedication of Washington's Addis Israel Synagogue and made a donation to the congregation. Numerous Jewish leaders praised Grant for the steps he took to make amends for his expulsion order. Grant's order is exceptional in U.S. history, but his suspicions about Jewish merchants were common. They were present from San Francisco to the Deep South to the Northeast. By 1890, there were more than 20,000 Jews in the former states of the Confederacy, with established communities in Charleston and New Orleans and a growing community in Atlanta. Jews also had shops and warehouses in small cities and towns across the region, from which merchants took their wares into rural areas. Historian Patrick Mason has written widely about violence in the 19th century against religious minorities.
In the late 19th century South, you had a number of Jewish peddlers who were itinerant salesmen. They were traveling salesmen, itinerant merchants. They would live in one place, oftentimes in a small town or a city somewhere. They would load up a wagon full of goods and they would travel, especially to farms, to very small towns, to reach people who were in places that were too small to have shops or merchants to service them.
In the backwoods of the American South, Jewish peddlers became a much more common sight after the Civil War. It was the only way that many Southerners encountered someone Jewish.
The Southern economy was pretty devastated after the Civil War, and the South was still a very rural region. So a lot of these small farmers who were scattered around the countryside, they didn't have access to a lot of consumer goods, a lot of things that were being produced and available in cities. It was oftentimes these Jewish peddlers, and it wasn't only Jewish peddlers, there were other kind of traveling salesmen as well. But there was this contingent of Jewish peddlers who they usually weren't pulling their own wagon. They had a horse or a donkey or something like that. But they were literally just going house to house, farm to farm in some of these really remote areas in the South.
Abram Saraski was an immigrant peddler from Poland. His brother had come over first and established himself as a merchant in Aiken, South Carolina, where he became respected enough to serve on city council for a decade. Abram Saraski became a sort of assistant to his older brother. He took a horse-drawn wagon into the rural areas around Aiken, selling goods and collecting on debts. On July 28, 1903, Abram didn't come back from his circuit. He stopped at the residence of Lee and Dora Green. Only Dora Green was home, and she invited him inside. Not long thereafter, Lee Green returned home and found his wife with Saraski.
What's clear is that Saraski is brutally murdered by Lee Green. He's shot multiple times and then actually hacked to death by an axe. So it's a horrific, horrific murder. And there are no other eyewitnesses other than the wife, Dora Green. This went to court the following year in 1904. And we actually have great records and affidavits and testimony from various people. And a number of people say that immediately after the murder, Lee Green told them he had killed Saraski. He always admitted to the murder.
Lee Green wasn't very good at covering his tracks.
But that's why, oh man, what's the Marine's name? Hefe, if you're still in here, help me. That's always saying, where's the Jew at? Accusing a rabbi of being cheating with his wife is, I laugh about it, but it is it is a serious trope as well.
He tried to hide the wagon and the body, which soon had
Yeah,
vultures
Lucas
circling above it.
Gage.
He asked Mary Drayton, an African-American neighbor, to clean the blood. Lee Green also tore out of Saraski's account book the pages that recorded his debt.
Mm.
In court, Lee Green testified that he saw Saraski attempting to seduce his wife. Enraged by this crime, he shot the peddler. Dora Green backed her husband up. It was a dishonest but very shrewd defense. Other witnesses told different stories. Green had shot at another peddler not long before he killed Saraski. Mary Drayton, the neighbor who had cleaned up the blood, testified that several weeks earlier, Lee Green had told her husband that he intended to kill Saraski. She also testified that she had overheard Green talking to a neighbor about concocting the story that Saraski was trying to rape his wife. And it worked. A jury acquitted Lee Green. The Saraski murder took place at a time of increased violence against Jews in the rural South.
I spent a summer basically going from archive to archive throughout the South, just seeing what I.
That wears your body down even more, Jeff. You get those spikes and valleys, your body relaxes in just enough time to have to fight a little more.
What I could find. And as I did so, a number of these cases emerged. I'm confident that there are many more cases that I didn't find, either that went unrecorded or that I just didn't come across. But I was able to find a couple of dozen of serious instances of violence against Jews in the late 19th century South. It pales compared, of course, to violence against African Americans, where we know that there's over 2,000 lynchings during this same time period, and then countless acts of non-lethal violence. But it's still not nothing, and it's more than we knew before.
Some of these were just acts of violence by individuals like Lee Green, but others were more organized, and they grew out of a toxic stew of racism and economic resentment. It's a complicated story, but in a nutshell, white Southern farmers resented merchants. Farmers would sometimes mortgage their land to obtain credit from these merchants, and when they couldn't pay back, they would lose their land to the merchants. And those merchants, having foreclosed on the farmer's land, sometimes leased it to black tenant farmers. White farmers then complained that this amounted to unfair competition. Some of the merchants involved were Jewish, and many of those white farmers came to understand themselves as victims of a Jewish conspiracy. These circumstances fueled the populist movement in American politics. And the mix of racial and economic resentment led to the rise of vigilante groups known as white caps. These secret societies mostly attacked black farmers in attempts to drive them off their land, but white cappers also targeted Jewish.
White cappers, I guess that is a cleaner way of saying what we know to be white nationalists, Klan, Nazis, etc.
Jewish merchants and landowners.
A lot of these vigilante groups are sort of hearkening back to the Ku Klux Klan. So they call themselves the White Caps. And when they attack people, it's called white capping them. They specifically go after Jewish landowners. They complain of the fact that Jews own so much land. It's these long-standing stereotypes of the Jewish banker, the Jewish moneylender, the oppressive Jewish merchant that's always charging too high of interest rates or ripping people off or pursuing unfair business practices.
Vigilantes were trying to use violence and intimidation to do the thing that General Grant had tried to do with his Order Number 11, get Jews out of town. Here's an example of a Jewish merchant with the last name Hiller. His first name is unknown, but we know that Hiller immigrated from Europe and settled in Summit, Mississippi in the 1850s. He did very well, and he owned 400 small farms, most of which he had obtained through foreclosures. Black tenants worked on many of Hiller's farms. In November 1892, whitecaps burned 27 houses on Hiller's farms. Night riders threatened to kill Hiller's agents. Many of his tenants fled, and Hiller himself moved to New Orleans. A well-organized effort drove Hiller out of what had been his home for 4 decades. Here's another example.
Early Saturday afternoon, October 25th, 1889, a large party of armed men rode into the northeastern Louisiana city of Delhi, not far from where Simon Witkowski had been violently driven from town 2 years previous. The mob fired their pistols into the showcases and front windows of the Jewish-owned mercantile establishments in the town, discharging about 50 shots into T. Hirsch's storefront window, smashing S. Bloom and Company, and sending bricks through the windows of Karp, Weil and Company. Threatening the Jewish store owners and putting them in terror for their lives, the rioters ordered them to leave the place within the next 12 to 15 hours, then rode away as fast as they had come. The townspeople, who were friendly to the Jewish merchants, expressed a general regret over the incident, and their disapproval of the mob's activities probably protected the merchants from further harm, at least in terms of making empty the threats of expulsion. Although the attackers were not publicly identified in the newspapers, their identities must have been known, since it was immediately ascertained that the motivation behind the violence was that the merchants held mortgages on the land of many small farmers in the area, and that certain debtors in the neighborhood were banded together to run their creditors away.
Some residents of Delhi, Louisiana, were outraged by the violence. But a lot of people in town thought the Jews had it coming.
I wonder if I can do that with my mortgage companies. Think it'll work.
One Delhi woman told a newspaper that Jewish stores had refused to hire non-Jewish clerks, and that Jewish merchants were parasites who took the town's money and kept it for themselves. This sort of Southern vigilantism peaked in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And white cappers and other vigilantes were more likely to kill or brutalize black tenants than Jewish merchants. But there were Jewish stores with bullets through their windows. And the economic resentments shaped the way that many Americans thought about Jews and money. The history of American Judaism is full of paradoxes. We've been discussing whitecapping in the rural American South. At the same time, there were widespread pogroms in Russia. There was an imperial decree ordering the expulsion of Jews from Moscow in 1891. So, for good reason, American Jews saw what happened in Delhi, Louisiana, as an isolated exception. They were grateful that America was not like Eastern Europe. Usually, there was outward civility between Jews and other Americans, whether in San Francisco or South Carolina. Solomon Heidenfeld served on the California Supreme Court. Abram Saraski's brother was on the Aiken City Council. At the same time, there were deep-rooted suspicions and misgivings about Jews, especially Jewish merchants, bankers, and businessmen. Whether in post-Gold Rush California, in the U.S. Army, in the R.G. Dunn Credit Agency, or in the backwoods and small towns of the South, these misgivings led to discrimination, and sometimes much worse. These suspicions about Jewish merchants and bankers grew into fears about a worldwide conspiracy, one in which rich and powerful Jews conspired to bring about the downfall of Western civilization through revolution and war. At the same time, Europeans and Americans were developing new ideas about Jews as a diseased and dangerous race. And that combination of conspiracy theories and anti-Jewish racism ushered in the most anti-Semitic era in American history. Thank you for listening to Antisemitism USA. It's a production of R2 Studios, part of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. Visit r2studios.org for a complete transcript of today's episode and for suggestions for further reading.
Let's see. I'm gonna do some kitty cam while I share this. She's never far away from me. Go ahead and share. It's always nappy time until midnight, and then it's run for about an hour, and then it's time to lay down.
TGIF, folks, it's Friday, February 28th, 2025, and I'm Don Reporte. Let's jump right into the fun facts for February 28th. 1935, DuPont chemist Wallace Carruthers created nylon, a synthetic polymer that would go on to revolutionize everything from stockings to parachutes. And in 1983, the MASH series finale was watched by over 105 million people, making it the most watched TV episode in U.S. history at the time. Now get ready for today's edition of Todd is Definitely Not an Anti-Semitic Socratic Parrot. It's a doozy.
But I will say this, the people that are in his environment, they got me a little...
Thanks for coming to my bank. Oh, oi, 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 oi. That's all I hear. Fucking oi. That's all I hear from you.
I'd just say they might be a little bit bank of oi. A little too bank of oi for me, if you know what I'm saying. Just saying. You know, you know. You know, you know. There might be a little grifting going on, right? There might be a little grifting. We'll just say that.
Oi, 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 oi.
Oi, oi, oi.
Which is really the gold card.
The
Oi,
Jewish
oi,
guy behind him
oi,
is like,
Bob.
you know, like merchandising.
That concludes today's edition of Todd is Definitely Not an Anti-Semitic Socratic Parrot and brings us to the end of the week for Friday, February 28th, 2025. I'm Don Reporte. Delivery will be taking over weekend editions of news, and my mental health owes her a debt of gratitude. Thanks for joining us. Have a fantastic weekend, and I look forward to seeing all of you on Monday.
Wonderful Spider Dog content as always. Can't get enough of Don Reporte, and let's play yesterday's. Yesterday's was pretty killer too. What's up, Asher?
Hello again. It's Thursday, February 27th, 2025, and I'm Don Reporte. Our fun facts for February 27th go from parades to particles. In 1827, the streets of New Orleans came alive with music, costumes, and revelry as the city held its first ever Mardi Gras parade. What started as a lively local tradition has become one of the most famous festivals in the world. Jump to 1932 when British physicist James Chadwick made a discovery that would change science forever: the neutron. This tiny neutral particle might not seem like much, but it led to major advancements in nuclear physics and, well, eventually the atomic bomb. So quite the scientific milestone, for better or worse. Now let's get to today's edition of Todd is definitely not an anti-Semitic echo chamber enthusiast.
Oy vey.
I believe Jewish people invented transgenderism.
Yep.
So it's ironic.
Ooh, that didn't age well, did it? Oh, that didn't age well, did it? Here we go. Oy vey. And for the record, my favorite character happens to be Rorschach. Yes, I know he's a Jew. He's my favorite character. Oy vey.
Well, wasn't that something? Before we head out, I'd like to send you over to our newest member of the news team, Ty Spillmore, our guy for covering entertainment and stuff.
Hi, folks. I'm Ty Spillmore. If you've been looking for some channels to check out, here are a couple I can suggest. First up, we've got G2, your one-stop shop for insightful videos, and a voice so deep and smooth, it could lull a raging storm into a gentle breeze. Whether you're here to learn or just vibe to the dulcet tones, G2's got you covered. And when the sun sets and you're in the mood for a little chaos, set sail for Hill Pirate Studios, where the antics are outrageous. The takes are hotter than a ship on fire, and no lolcow is safe. We're talking full-throttle internet spectacle, folks. So grab your rum, maybe a cutlass, and get ready for the ride. Back to you, Don.
Thanks, Ty. It's great to have you aboard. That concludes today's edition of Todd is definitely not an anti-Semitic echo chamber enthusiast for Thursday, February 27th, 2025. I'm Don Reporte. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Spider Dog, for letting me play these. Please, please, please visit Spider Dog and subscribe if you haven't. I know most of us have here, but I still have to say. And Shabbat Shalom to Ashra and Dale. So anyway, that's all I had today. I was in a what's up, East Coast? Me and Mrs. Metcalf was having a discussion on race, and if you didn't see this, you go, Todd. See this tiny sliver here, Todd? Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Shinto. Just Jews are controlling the world. But who is controlling the world? Doge recommends cuts to the FAA. Hundreds of workers get fired, including those tasked with producing air traffic navigation maps. Now, Elon Starlink is reportedly in line to take over a $2 billion contract to upgrade the nation's air traffic control systems. All right. What's up, Lefty? I hope everybody has a good day. Good Friday. Hope Jeff feels better. Can give y'all some entertainment instead of dry dry facts. I mean, yeah, you know, they are just a crutch. I'm sure. I'm sure some people would float that one. Some people probably believe it. Dry whats, facts and figures. Thanks, Nomad. Um, is she? Oh, yeah. Let me take this down. She's got a lot of fluffiness to keep clean. Brushing her hair almost every day doesn't cut it. She thinks she is, Angel. You were doxing that kitty. What was Coded saying somebody's name was soft doxing them? Just their first name. Yeah, that's what's so rough is both of them have been shedding, so I got black and white hair everywhere. Poor Bobby. He likes me so much, though. What's up, Freddie? All right, y'all. I want to set something new. Always shout out to Ben Buttercup.